Good morning and welcome to United Way for Southeastern Michigan's virtual town hall. My name is Dr. Dershawn Brown, and today we will be joined by Mary Grech with Education Trust Midwest to discuss equity in education funding. The last 10 minutes of today's town hall are reserved for questions, so please leave your questions in the Q&A box if you're watching via Zoom or in the comment box on Facebook. Now I would like to welcome United Way's Chief Impact Officer, Tanya Adair, to say a few words.
Thank you, Deshawn. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special edition of our weekly virtual town hall. Disparities in education have always existed, but the pandemic has heightened and highlighted these disparities. As we begin looking to the future, it's essential that we consider equity in all of our decision-making. And these efforts begin with ensuring our schools are funded equitably. That is why we are super excited to be joined today by Mary Grech, Senior Data and Policy Analyst for the Education Trust Midwest. I'm excited because Mary and I share a common beginning. Mary began her career as an elementary school teacher, where she worked with students to strengthen their early literacy skills. Her time in the classroom further developed her passion for improving educational opportunities for students of all backgrounds. Mary holds a bachelor's degree from the College of William and Mary and a master's in education policy and management from Harvard University. Mary is now the Senior Data and Policy Analyst for Education Trust Midwest, where she supports qualitative and quantitative research initiatives. Please join me in welcoming Mary Grech to speak with us today. Mary, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very thankful for the opportunity and for the United Way for hosting this discussion. So as Tanya mentioned, I'm a Senior Data Policy Analyst at the Education Trust Midwest, and we are a nonpartisan research, policy, technical assistance, and advocacy organization, and we are focused first and foremost on improving education opportunities and outcomes for Michigan's most underserved students. So in all that we do, our focus is resting squarely on ensuring that every child in our state, no matter their family's income, no matter where they live, their disability status, immigration status, race, how they may be attending school this year, we want to ensure that they are receiving the highest quality education that they need and deserve. So today I'm going to start by beginning with some slides and sharing some information about how Michigan is performing and how funding equity is so important to bringing about the education equity that Tanya mentioned is so necessary in our state. So I'm going to share my screen with some slides to get us started. All right. Can everyone see the?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So first, to start off, it's really important to acknowledge that COVID-19 has brought about additional challenges in Michigan's education space, but there were gaps in opportunity that have existed long before the pandemic. And we know that Michigan is already struggling with its performance compared to the rest of the nation. Michigan is actually among the bottom half of states for performance in 4th grade reading and 8th grade math. And we know that education outcomes and opportunities for students with disabilities, English language learners, and low-income students are even more of a challenge. So one of the things that we wanted to start off our conversation with today is how the impact of that lack of quality in our system can really fall on to our students. Here we're showing the remediation rate for Michigan's students, and it's striking that nearly a quarter of students had to take an additional course, at least one remediation course, after enrolling in one of Michigan's post-secondary programs after high school, due to the issues in quality of education that they received. And we see that that gap is even greater for Michigan's for students who are in Michigan's poorest districts and than their wealthiest districts. And ultimately, this is not good for our students in the short term or the long term for us as a state. If our students were supported in achieving higher, even just reaching the national average, one of the estimates shows that the lifetime earnings of Michigan students collectively could actually increase to more than $27 billion more if their achievement matched the national average. So as we're thinking about education equity and what it really means to support every student and meet their unique needs, it's so critical to take a hard look at the inputs to our education system. It is not students being less capable than their peers across the country or their peers within the state. It's about ensuring that they actually have the resources and supports that they need to reach those high standards we know that they are absolutely capable of reaching. So that is why it's so important for us to talk about funding equity today. So we've been looking at Michigan's school funding within the national landscape. And one of the things that we've seen is that investing in Michigan students, and especially in Michigan's underserved students, so low-income students, students with disabilities, English language learners, students who are in foster care, or homeless students, has been a real challenge within our state and when we look across the country. So we've learned that Michigan is actually one of the bottom 5 states nationally for the funding gap between high poverty and low poverty districts. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. We also learned that over the last 2 decades or so, between 1995 and 2015, Michigan had the lowest total educational revenue growth of any state, in our country. And Michigan received a D for how well it was targeting funding to the highest poverty districts relative to our wealthiest or lowest poverty districts. So there are major challenges around funding equity, and we have to think about those as we work towards a new normal where our state is much higher performing for every group of students. So let's focus in a little bit more on funding equity specifically. This chart is showing how Michigan is among the bottom 5 states in the nation for the gap between dollars allocated towards your highest poverty, so poorest districts, and your lowest poverty or wealthiest districts. And you can see that there's actually a 5% gap between those groups of districts. So we are providing less funding to the districts that have higher poverty and higher student needs. And one thing that we know research has shown is that it actually does take more investment and more dollars and more support to really improve outcomes for low-income students and ensure that they have the same opportunities and same sort of supports to achieve like their wealthier peers. So it's really concerning that Michigan has not been reflecting the values of equity in the way that dollars have been distributed across districts. At the same time, something that is encouraging about this chart is that it is actually just showing us dollars that are state dollars and local dollars. So it's dollars that our legislative leaders have the authority over how to distribute. So while this is a reflection of inequitable distribution in the past, we also have a really great opportunity at the state level to allocate dollars differently and to invest in students with higher needs to make sure that they can achieve at the same levels and have supports that they need beyond academic supports as well. So one of the focuses of our organization around equitable funding was laying out a set of principles that can really provide a North Star for our state about where we can and should be heading in school funding in order to support a vision of education equity, which is so critical. So these are the principles that we laid out in our report in January 2020, Michigan School Funding Crisis and Opportunity. And so I'll walk through some of these today as well. So the first is providing funding according to student need. And this is a very important and big shift. It means providing funding based on a student's need rather than their zip code or the district that they attend. We have seen the research that shows it takes twice as much to really help a low-income student have the same opportunities as a wealthier student to achieve. We need at least 75% more for English language learners. So making sure that that investment is made and that we're distributing dollars based on students and really centering them in our funding system rather than districts or zip code. The second is providing more funding to districts with lower fiscal capacity. So there's been really important efforts over the last 2 decades to make sure that the dollars distributed to districts are at least the same, and those need to continue. And we also need to acknowledge the unique needs that some districts have, such as rural districts, which may have higher costs for transportation, given the physical proximity between their students and schools may be greater. So we want to make sure that we are acknowledging those needs as well to ensure that there's no barriers. We also know that it's not just about the amount of dollars, and money is not the only thing that can bring about change. It's really important to make sure that those dollars are spent well, and that we really know how they're being spent and how they're being allocated. So the last 3 principles that you see here are really focused on that. So first, ensuring that the dollars that we are spending in education are actually used well to improve student learning experiences and outcomes. Next, being transparent about the system's design itself so that we can all understand it, and monitoring funding that's going to districts to ensure that it's actually achieving the goals that those dollars were set out to be spent on. So we want to make sure that if dollars are being allocated towards low-income students or students with disabilities or English language learners, that they're actually reaching those students in their classrooms and making a difference. And then we also want to share clear and transparent data about the amount of funding that schools should be getting. It's really important for us to not just look at funding equity at the state level and looking across districts, but once those dollars have reached the district, it's really important to zoom in at how they've been distributed to schools within the district, and are they reaching the schools where the students have greater needs. As Tanya mentioned, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has just made the needs of Michigan's education system even greater. A recent analysis by McKinsey estimated that American students were likely to fall behind 7 months on average, and that those losses were expected to be even greater for historically underserved student groups. Black students may fall behind more than 10 months in their average learning. Latino students may fall more than 9 months behind. Low-income students could fall more than a year behind. And parents and families across our state have had to make really difficult decisions about where to send their student this year. Are the trade-offs of virtual school worth the health and safety precautions that it could bring about? And so we need to be prepared as a system to support students and families through this crisis, ensure educators have the resources and supports that they need to really reach their students and continue their learning. But we also need to think about what we're going to do as we are exiting the pandemic. How are we going to help to support students who may have had disruptions in their learning throughout this time? So as we are working to grow towards a more equitable system of funding in our state, we absolutely believe in opportunity for all, that every student should have that opportunity for an excellent education. And one action that you can take today is taking our Fair Funding Pledge and making it your voice heard and making it clear to state leaders that you do support funding equity, and that we can move Michigan to a new normal and to a place that gives every child the quality education that they deserve. And you are welcome to text OPP4ALL, so that's OPP for the number 4 all, to 55444 to learn more about our organization and what we're doing on the issue of funding equity.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that information. Very enlightening, and some startling, statistics, especially with the average student falling behind 7 months, and it varying for different, sectors. Definitely something we need to jump on and get a handle on so that our students are not left behind. But thank you for sharing that information with us. And so we're going to go into our Q&A now. And the first question is, if schools all receive the same amount per pupil, can you explain how some schools are receiving less funding?
So the first thing to know is that all schools actually aren't receiving the same amount per pupil. Only about 84% of the districts in the state receive the state's minimum amounts, about $8,000. But there's actually a set of districts, about 15%, that receive more for every student that they enroll. And so that is something that will be really important as we're addressing education equity. When we see districts that are wealthier receiving upwards of $12,000 per pupil, but districts that have much higher needs only receiving $8,000 for that student, that's a big concern when it comes to funding equity. And then on top of that, we want to make sure that there's additional funding besides that base amount that districts get for every student that they enroll. How are they also getting additional dollars for the students who have unique needs? They're low-income students, they're English language learners, they're students with disabilities. And how do we make sure that that amount of additional dollars is following the research and is going to be enough to really support them to have all of their opportunities? Those are really critical focus points and questions for us.
Absolutely, absolutely. The next question is, are there ways we as community members or parents can make funding more equitable within our own school district?
Absolutely. So it's really important to have a voice in how decisions are being made in your district. And in order to really have that informed voice, it's important to have data. We need to have good information about how dollars are being spent at the district level between different schools. And so making sure that you are lifting up the need and desire for that information within your district, but also to our state level leaders who can play a really important role in providing that transparency. And really holding districts accountable for spending the dollars that they receive on the students that they're intended for.
Yes. This data is so shocking, Mary. It really is. What is the conversation at the state level for making these equitable changes?
So we've definitely seen things in recent months that have been encouraging around many leaders and organizations thinking more and more about equity and funding. So not just that we need more money, which is absolutely important, but how do we make sure that we're making investments in our most underserved students a priority? So we were really encouraged to see how Governor Whitmer was distributing her dollars from the federal government in response to education equity towards districts that had higher needs and towards systemic improvements. We were excited to see the Michigan Department of Education doing similar. So it's great that within those decisions, we've seen equity prioritized. And it was also great that within the budget, we didn't see the enormous cuts that we were really worried about seeing. At the same time, though, we need to see more investments for the students who have additional needs, especially amid the pandemic. So there's definitely conversation around funding equity, which is really encouraging.
Absolutely. Relatedly, how is your organization engaging with the legislature, administration to get your policy agenda adopted?
So a really important part of that is engaging with the public and with you all and having you engage with us. So please do sign up for the Fair Funding Pledge and get informed, lift up your voice, make sure that funding equity is clear as a priority for you as well. For us as an organization, we're always having conversations with state leaders and organizations who are working at the state level to bring about this issue. Lifting up our report in January was really important for bringing that focus on equity into the conversation around school funding. And our conversations with the legislature have really echoed those principles throughout all of our engagement and work.
Great. Now you mentioned the pledge. Besides that, how can individuals or organizations show support?
So absolutely engaging with us as an organization and learning all the different things that we can around funding equity where we are. But I think also just noting within your school, what are the things that your student needs to have the supports that they need to be successful. And if you're not seeing those, lifting your voice at the state and district level, continuing to read the really great research that's coming out from organizations across the state around Michigan's challenges in adequacy and equity, getting informed and lifting up your voice are really important. And advocating for data. We've got to know what's going on. We've got to know where the dollars are going.
Yes, absolutely. Next question is there an effort being made to support schools, students, and families more holistically through education funding, like bringing wraparound and social services into the school environment?
Yes. That is one of the most important pieces of funding equity. It's not about just the academics. Academic, social, emotional, wraparound services go hand in hand. So as we are investing more in students, we're recognizing all of those additional supports that they need beyond academics, and making sure that those resources are there. Often in wealthier districts, those resources may already be in place, and they may not be in place in the same way in the districts that actually have a really high need for those wraparound services and social emotional learning. So by prioritizing funding equity and putting a value, or expressing our values and prioritizing our most vulnerable students, we are making sure that they have the resources for those wraparound supports in addition to all of the academic work that they are doing.
Okay, great. Can you explain in layman's terms how the funding for students is calculated?
Sure. So something that is really important to know is that the state leaders actually have a lot of decision-making power around how that works.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the spending that comes into our schools is coming from sales tax and other forms of state level taxes. The legislature is then responsible for assigning that dollar amount that goes out to every single student in the different districts in the state. And as we mentioned a little earlier, that actually is different across districts. So that's one of the things that is a challenge within the formula and is important to work on. The next layer of that, after dollars have been sent to each district for each student that they enroll, is dollars that are meant for the additional needs and supports of our most underserved or vulnerable student populations. So the legislature then will add additional money to what they send to each of the districts for low-income students or students with disabilities, like English language learners, et cetera. And then on top of that, there's also funding that is given to districts for programs or grant initiatives, other sorts of programs and supports that they may be providing. So those are three sort of basic pieces of it. It's very complicated. That's something that we need to bring more transparency around and make it something that we can really understand and therefore engage with.
Mm-hmm.
But that's sort of the basics of the process.
Okay. Can you speak to Prop A and how it impacts equitable funding? And part two of that is equitable funding possible with Prop A in place?
Yeah, so Prop A was passed in the early 90s, and basically the big shift that it brought to our system was that instead of having the dollars spent on each student be mostly based on local property taxes, which was very inequitable, you can imagine the different levels of wealth within communities had a big impact on the dollars that were spent in those communities on students. It really brought all of that up to the state level. The challenge is that when it was passed and the state received the authority to set what that per pupil funding was going to be for each district, they actually set it based on where funding levels had previously been. So it almost baked in the inequities of the old system.
Mm-hmm.
But the really great thing about Prop A is that it did bake in that lever for the state leaders to play more of a role in how dollars were distributed across districts. And that is why it's really important that was really important legislation to getting us to a place where we could have more funding equity. So it is possible to bring more equity into the system, moving to a place that is more of a weighted student funding model where we have an equal share of dollars going to each student and then additional dollars for each of that student's need, so that the funding is based on their need and not their zip code, is something that's really important and will take systemic change as well.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the impacts of COVID-19. COVID-19 has resulted in many Michigan schools opting for virtual instruction, as we mentioned. How does Michigan's digital divide relate to school funding inequities?
So Michigan's digital divide is striking. It's something that we've looked at as an organization and have an interactive map I'm happy to share with you all. But one of the things that we saw is a pattern that we see across lots of education opportunities, which is that our lowest income students, students of color, were more likely to be impacted by the digital divide. And funding equity is important in any time. It's been especially important during the pandemic. So not having those resources within a district to meet student needs is now meaning not necessarily having the money for a laptop and the technology infrastructure, or the support for their educators to figure out how to do virtual instruction well, or to support parents and family members who are helping their student use that device. Those resources really matter now more than ever. And the digital divide is just an example of an issue where that investment over time has built up. And so districts that had more resources and were ready to roll out that technology, or students who may have had that in their home, had that resource. And many students in Michigan don't have that right now. So investment is really important to addressing that.
Right. Well, we did enter the map into the chat. So if you're interested in seeing the map that Mary referenced on the digital divide, it is in the chat. There's a link there. And unfortunately, we have run out of time for questions, but these were all awesome questions. I don't know, I think we need another session on this topic because it's so prevalent, you know, for today. And I'll leave it there. And I am going to turn it back over to Tanya Adair.
Wow, thank you, Mary. Thank you for sharing with us today and helping us to learn more about how we can make more equitable decisions and how we can help. I've already signed up, sent the text message to get more information so that I can sign up to make the pledge. As a reminder, for those of you who may be experiencing a need, our 211 helpline remains available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Please call, or if you know someone that may be experiencing a need. We may maintain a running list of available services in the community and can connect you to the supports that you need. You can also look up resources in your area by using our 211 resource database at unitedwaysem.org/211. I'd also like to take a moment to remind everyone to go vote. You can vote now by visiting your clerk's office or applying online for an absentee ballot. I just picked mine up yesterday. You can also visit unitedwaysem.org/vote to find out more about what's on your ballot, where to find your precinct, and so much more. Remember, there is so much more than just the presidential election on the ballot, so make sure that you are completing the entire ballot. Also, speaking of equity, remember there's still time to fill out your census if you haven't already. The census impacts funding for essential programs like food assistance and healthcare, so please visit my2020census.gov to complete the census today. Today's town hall is just one installment of a series of town halls we are providing to connect you with the information and resources you need. Our next town hall will focus on an important topic for so many families during the pandemic, helping children cope with stress, with Dr. Christopher Trinkataska. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. I hope he'll forgive me if he hears this for butchering his name. But he's the professor of psychology at Wayne State University. To see our previous town halls, please visit unitedwaysem.org/virtual town halls. The website is also included in the chat box today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and please stay safe. Mary, again, thank you for the information that you provided. It has been extremely helpful for me, and I'm hoping it's been helpful for everyone else that's on the call. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.